If I were in Beijing, I'd want China to be the dominant power by far in East Asia. I'd want to be a regional hegemon, just as I, as an American, am happy that we're a regional hegemon in the Western Hemisphere. The Chinese want to be able to roam all around the globe with their military forces, just like the United States roams all around the globe. Why? Because that's the best way to protect your economic and political interests. Well, a couple points. One is you want to remember that Trump said after he was elected in 2016 that he was going to fundamentally change foreign policy around the world. You remember he said that he was going to have good relations with Russia, and he was going to have especially good relations with Vladimir Putin. And that did not happen. And it did not happen because Trump was up against powerful forces inside the United States that have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. I think Trump, when he was elected in 2016, was interested in challenging the deep state, but he lost and he moved back toward, the standard Republican foreign policy positions. And I think that'll happen again if he's reelected this fall. So Trump is going to come into power and he's going to say that he's going to change X and Y and Z. He's going to implement a new policy here and there. He's going to end the Ukraine war. You know the rhetoric. But whether he does that is another matter. He didn't do it in his first term. And I don't think he's going to radically alter American foreign policy in his second term. Second point I would make to you is that the area of the world where he really wants to change foreign policy is in Europe. And it's with regard to the Ukraine war and with regard to Vladimir Putin. Trump is interested in having good relations with the Russians, especially with Putin. And he's interested in ending the Ukraine war. But he has not said that he's going to change America's policy in East Asia. And you want to remember that Trump is the president who in 2017 abandoned engagement policy and adopted containment policy. So Trump has a history of challenging China, treating China as an adversary. And there's no reason to think that if he's elected, he's going to change or even try to change America's policy in East Asia toward China. He may try to change American policy towards Russia over the Ukraine war, but he's not going to have any effect, or he's not going to try to have any effect or try to change U.S. policy toward China. So I don't think it matters much whether you have Trump or Harris in the White House. And I would just add to that, even if Trump said he was going to change U.S. policy in East Asia, I don't think he could do it at this point in time. I think the die is cast here. You're going to have a serious security competition between China and the United States for probably the rest of this century. Well, I actually think the conflict between China and the Philippines, which is taking place in the South China Sea, tells you that the South China Sea is a more dangerous flashpoint than Taiwan is. As I said before, I don't think it's likely that you'll have a war over Taiwan. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I don't think it's likely. I think it's more likely that you'll have a conflict in the South China Sea that involves both the United States and China. As you know, the United States is closely allied with the Philippines. And the United States has a formal treaty with the Philippines. And the United States has a deep-seated interest in making sure that China does not dominate the South China Sea. So I would argue that as this conflict between the Philippines and China escalates, it is likely that the United States will come in or form closer and closer relations with the the Filipinos. And I wouldn't be surprised if at some point in the not too distant future, the United States commits itself to escorting Filipino ships in the South China Sea. And of course, this would lead to serious trouble with China, because China would not be happy at all if the United States was escorting Filipino ships. But I think, it is a likely scenario moving forward. I believe from China's point of view, it makes eminently good sense to try to push the Americans out of East Asia, push them back beyond the first island chain, and then push them back beyond the second island chain. If I were a policymaker in Beijing, that's what I would want to do. But you have to understand that from an American point of view, it's in your interest, it's in America's interest not to let that happen, and to have freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, and to limit Chinese military presence. And this is why the situation is so dangerous. And I think that given what's going on between the Filipinos and the Chinese involving the second Thomas Shoal is evidence that this flashpoint is more likely to lead to trouble between the United States and China than Taiwan is. I think if you talk about India, you have to talk about three different flashpoints. One is East Asia. Two is the Himalaya Mountains. This is the India-China border. And three is the Indian Ocean. And I think that India is of little strategic value in East Asia. I think if a conflict breaks out in East Asia, the Indian military is not going to be involved. So when we talk about the South China Sea, the East China Sea, Taiwan, or the Korean Peninsula, I think India is largely irrelevant for those contingencies. With regard to the India-China border, which is a seriously dangerous flashpoint, I don't think the United States is going to get involved there. I think that's basically a conflict that will involve the Chinese on one side and the Indians on the other side. So I think there's really no connection there, no meaningful connection between the United States and India. I find it hard to see them acting as allies, the United States and India acting as allies up in the Himalayas. That'll be China versus India. I think the Indian Ocean is a different matter. I think that what's happening here is that China is developing a blue water navy. It's in the early stages, but China is interested in developing meaningful power projection capability. I've long argued that what China is trying to do is imitate the United States. And what do I mean by that? First of all, China is trying to become a regional hegemon in East Asia, just like the United States is a regional hegemon in the Western Hemisphere. And again, from China's point of view, this makes eminently good sense. If I were in Beijing, I'd want China to be the dominant power by far in East Asia. I'd want to be a regional hegemon, just as I, as an American, am happy that we're a regional hegemon in the Western Hemisphere. So China's first goal, in my opinion, is to establish regional hegemony, if it can, in East Asia. Its second goal, and here again we're imitating the United States, is to develop a blue water navy and other military assets that give it significant power projection capability. The Chinese want to be able to roam all around the globe with their military forces, just like the United States roams all around the globe. Why? Because that's the best way to protect your economic and political interests. Now, let's get back to the Indian Ocean. As you know, China has to go through the Straits of Malacca and then into the Indian Ocean to get to the Persian Gulf. And China has a deep-seated interest in developing power projection capabilities that can cover the route from the eastern coast of China all the way to the Persian Gulf, because China gets lots of oil from the Persian Gulf. This means that China is going to develop a blue water navy that moves through the Indian Ocean. This scares the Indians greatly. It scares the Americans greatly. And it's in the Indian Ocean, in my opinion, where you're likely to see meaningful military cooperation between India and the United States. That's the flashpoint, the potential flashpoint, where the Indians and the Americans are likely to have a vested interest in working together to counter Chinese influence, or to counter the Chinese military, or to counter the power projection capability that China is in the process of developing.
朋友都知道我是很挑剔的，防晒乳我选 KISS 皇家呵护抗光清爽高防晒凝露，因为它有媲美蓝光神盾的抓藻植萃，保护我在阳光下延缓肌肤老化，维持青春弹力。可以防御工作环境里的3C 商品，各种光源对肌肤的伤害，擦起来清爽不黏腻。我特别喜欢它做到海洋友善，365天，天天抗光抗老化，是我的保养日常。你呢？呵护您，呵护全家人，专属你的 KISS Royal Care 抗光清爽高防晒凝露。